the land of Babylon, far from his home in Jerusalem, lived a man named Ezekiel. He was not a soldier or a king, but a priest taken as a prisoner when the Babylonians conquered Judah. Ezekiel's story is one of visions and strange messages, prophecies that seemed impossible but came true, and a God who spoke in ways that were both scary and amazing. Ezekiel started his life like many young priests, learning the laws and traditions of his people. He knew the stories of Abraham, of Moses, and of David. He understood the importance of the temple in Jerusalem, the place where God lived among them. But his world changed forever when he was taken captive along with thousands of others. They were forced to leave their homes, their families, and everything they knew behind. Ezekiel found himself in a new land, surrounded by people who worshiped different gods and followed different rules. He missed Jerusalem, he missed the temple, and he worried about his people who were suffering far away. One day, as Ezekiel sat by the river Chebar, something extraordinary happened. The sky seemed to open up, and Ezekiel saw a vision, a powerful swirling storm, a great cloud with flashing fire and shining light. Inside he saw creatures unlike anything he had ever imagined. They had faces of a man, a lion, an ox, and an eagle. And beside them were wheels within wheels covered in eyes. These creatures moved with incredible speed and power, and above them was a throne. And on that throne sat someone who looked like a man but shone with a brilliant light. This was God's glory. Ezekiel had never seen anything like it. He fell to the ground in fear, and all then a voice spoke to him. "Son of man, stand on your feet. I am going to speak to you." The voice told Ezekiel that he was being sent to the people of Israel to warn them about their sins. They had turned away from God and were worshiping idols and doing evil things. Ezekiel was told to tell them to change their ways or face the consequences. Ezekiel was scared. He knew that the people were stubborn and rebellious. They probably wouldn't listen to him, but God promised to be with him, to give him strength and courage. "Do not be afraid of them," God said. "Though briars and thorns are all around you, and you live among scorpions, do not be afraid of what they say or terrified by their faces, though they are a rebellious people." Ezekiel knew that he had to obey God no matter what, so Ezekiel began to speak to the people. He told them about the vision he had seen and the message he had received. He warned them about the coming destruction and urged them to repent and turn back to God. But the people didn't listen. They mocked him. They ignored him. They refused to believe that their city would be destroyed or that God would punish them. Ezekiel didn't give up. He continued to speak. God gave him strange and powerful messages to share. He acted out parables like a play to get their attention. He lay on his side for hundreds of days to symbolize the suffering of Israel and Judah. He shaved his head and beard and burned the hair to show what would happen to the people when Jerusalem fell. Some of Ezekiel's prophecies were hard to understand. He talked about dry bones coming back to life and a new temple being built in Jerusalem. These visions seemed impossible, but Ezekiel believed that God would fulfill his promises even when things looked hopeless. He knew that God had a plan for his people, even in the midst of their suffering. Then, one day, the news came: Jerusalem had fallen, the temple had been destroyed, and the people had been slaughtered or taken captive. Ezekiel's prophecies had come true. The people were devastated. They felt like they had lost everything: their home, their city, and their hope. But Ezekiel didn't despair. He knew that God was still in control and that he had a future for them. Ezekiel began to speak words of comfort and hope. He told the people that God would gather them back from the nations where they had been scattered. He promised them a new covenant, a new heart, and a new spirit. He said that God would cleanse them from their sins and restore them to their land. Ezekiel's message was that even though they had suffered greatly, God still loved them and had a plan to redeem them. Ezekiel's visions and prophecies had a huge impact on the people of Israel. They helped them to understand why they had suffered and gave them hope for the future. His words were written down and became part of the Bible. The book of Ezekiel is still read and studied today by people all over the world who are looking for guidance and hope. Ezekiel's story teaches us that God speaks to his people in many ways, sometimes through visions, sometimes through prophecies, and sometimes through ordinary people who are willing to listen and obey. It also teaches us that even when things look dark and hopeless, God is still in control and that he has a plan for our lives. We can learn from Ezekiel's example to trust God even when we don't understand and to speak the truth even when it's hard. Ezekiel's life was a difficult one. He faced many challenges and hardships, but he remained faithful to God throughout it all. He was a true prophet, messenger of hope, and a witness to God's power and love. His story is a reminder that God can use anyone, no matter how ordinary or unlikely, to accomplish his purposes and to bring his message to the world. Now, let us look closer at some of the important parts of Ezekiel's story, the visions, the prophecies, and the impact they had on the people of Israel and on history. The visions of Ezekiel are some of the most strange and powerful in the entire Bible. The vision of the creatures with four faces and the wheels within wheels is particularly striking. It's hard to understand exactly what these visions mean, but they seem to represent God's power, his glory, and his ability to move in mysterious ways. Another important vision is the one of the valley of dry bones. Ezekiel saw a valley full of bones scattered everywhere. God asked him, "Son of man, can these bones live?" Ezekiel replied, "O Lord God, you know." Then God told Ezekiel to prophesy to the bones, to tell them to come back to life. And as he prophesied, the bones began to rattle and come together. They were covered with flesh and skin. And then they stood up, a vast army. This vision is a powerful symbol of hope and restoration. It shows that even when things seem completely dead and hopeless, God can bring new life. It's a reminder that God can take broken things and make them whole again, and that he can bring hope out of despair. Ezekiel's prophecies were also very important. He predicted the destruction of Jerusalem, the exile of the people, and the eventual return to the land. These prophecies came true exactly as Ezekiel had said, which proved that he was a true prophet of God. One of Ezekiel's most important prophecies is about the new covenant. He said that God would make a new covenant with his people, a covenant that would be written on their hearts instead of on stone. This new covenant would bring forgiveness of sins and a new relationship with God. This prophecy points to the coming of Jesus Christ, who would establish the new covenant through his death and resurrection. Ezekiel's prophecies had a profound impact on the people of Israel. They helped them to understand why they had suffered and gave them hope for the future. They also helped to shape their understanding of God and his plan for the world. Ezekiel's message was that God is just and holy, but also merciful and loving. He punishes sin, but he also offers forgiveness and restoration. Ezekiel's story is a reminder that God is always faithful to his promises. Even when things seem impossible, we can trust that God has a plan for our lives, and that he will work all things together for good, even in the midst of suffering and hardship. Ezekiel's example encourages us to be faithful to God, to speak the truth, and to trust in his power and love. Ezekiel's book is full of symbolism and imagery. The creatures with four faces, the wheels within wheels, the valley of dry bones, and the new temple are all powerful symbols that convey important spiritual truths. These symbols help us to understand God's character, his power, and his plan for the world. The book of Ezekiel also contains many practical lessons for our lives. It teaches us about the importance of obedience to God, the need to repent of our sins, and the power of hope and faith. Ezekiel's example challenges us to live lives that are pleasing to God and to be witnesses to his love and grace. Ezekiel's story is a testament to the power of God to transform lives and to bring hope to the hopeless. It's a reminder that God is always with us, even in the darkest of times, and that he has a plan for our future. We can learn from Ezekiel's example to trust God, to obey his word, and to share his love with the world. The enigma of Ezekiel lies in the fact that his visions and prophecies are both mysterious and profound. They challenge us to think deeply about God, his character, and his plan for the world. They also encourage us to live lives that are worthy of his calling. Ezekiel's story is not just a story from the past, it's a story that is relevant to our lives today. It speaks to our hopes, our fears, and our struggles. It reminds us that God is always with us and that he has a plan for our lives. We can learn from Ezekiel's example to trust God, to obey his word, and to share his love with the world. So as we read and study the book of Ezekiel, let us be open to the messages that God has for us. Let us be willing to be challenged and transformed by his word, and let us be inspired to live lives that are pleasing to him. Ezekiel's story is a story of faith, hope, and love. It's a story that has shaped history and continues to inspire people all over the world. It's a story that reminds us that God is always with us, and that He has a plan for our lives. In the land of Babylon long ago lived a man named Ezekiel. He was a priest and a prophet, but his life changed a lot when he was taken from his home in Judah and brought to Babylon as a captive with many other people. This happened because the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, had attacked Jerusalem and taken over the land. Ezekiel's story is special because God showed him amazing visions and told him things that would happen in the future. These messages were not just for the people of his time, but for all people who wanted to understand God's plans. Ezekiel's book in the Bible is full of these strange and wonderful visions. They are like puzzles that tell important stories about God's love, His anger, and His promise to make things right again. One of the first big visions Ezekiel had was by the Kebar River in Babylon. This vision was so powerful and strange that it made Ezekiel fall to the ground. He saw a storm coming from the north with bright clouds and fire flashing everywhere. In the middle of the fire, he saw four living creatures. These creatures looked like humans, but each had four faces: one of a man, one of a lion, one of an ox, and one of an eagle. They also had four wings, and their legs were straight like a calf's with shiny bronze hooves. Beside each creature was a wheel that looked like it was made of sparkling jewels. These wheels could move in any direction without turning, and the creatures could move with them wherever they went. Above the creatures was a platform that looked like shining crystal. Above the platform was a throne, and on the throne was someone who looked like a man surrounded by bright light. This was a vision of God's glory and power. The voice of God spoke to Ezekiel from the throne and told him to stand up. God had a very important job for him to do. God said, "Ezekiel, son of man, I am sending you to the people of Israel. They have turned against me, and they do not listen to my words. You must tell them what I say, whether they want to hear it or not. Do not be afraid of them, even if they are stubborn and rebellious." God told Ezekiel that he was like a watchman for the people of Israel. It was his job to warn them when danger was coming from God. If Ezekiel did not warn them, then God would hold him responsible. God gave Ezekiel a scroll to eat. The scroll had words of sadness and warning written on it. When Ezekiel ate the scroll, it tasted as sweet as honey. This showed that even though the message was hard, it was important and good to share. God wanted Ezekiel to speak his words with courage and without fear. He told him that the people might not listen, but Ezekiel had to be faithful and tell them the truth. Ezekiel then goes back to the captives in Babylon and lives among them, and he sees how they have broken God's laws and worshipped false gods, and also how they have also polluted the land with their sins. And Ezekiel sees that these acts cause God to be angry at the people. And so Ezekiel then starts to predict that God will soon punish Jerusalem for all of these sins that they have committed. And he also warns them that they need to change their ways and turn back to God before it is too late. But sadly, the people don't listen, and they keep doing all of the wrong things, and Ezekiel understands that there will be consequences. Ezekiel had more visions that showed what would happen to Jerusalem. One vision showed him the temple in Jerusalem, where people worshipped God. But Ezekiel saw terrible things happening there. He saw idols being worshipped in the temple and secret sins being committed. This made God very angry, and he was going to punish the city. In another vision, Ezekiel saw 6 men coming towards Jerusalem, each carrying a weapon. And there was also another man among them with a writing kit, and God told this man to go through the city and put a mark on the foreheads of all those who were sad and upset about the evil things that were happening in Jerusalem. The other 6 men were told to follow him and kill everyone who did not have the mark: men, women, old people, and children. But they were not allowed to touch anyone who had the mark. This vision showed that God would punish the wicked, but he would also protect those who were faithful to him. Ezekiel used strange actions to show the people what was going to happen to Jerusalem. God told him to draw a picture of Jerusalem on a brick and then lay siege to it. This means he had to act like he was attacking the city. He also had to lie on his left side for 390 days to show how long Israel would be punished, and then on his right side for 40 days to show how long Judah would be punished. God also told him to eat food that was cooked over cow dung. This was a sign that the people in Jerusalem would have very little food during the siege, and they would have to eat unclean things. Ezekiel didn't want to do this, so God let him use cow dung instead of human dung. These actions were like a play that showed everyone what was coming. Jerusalem was destroyed just like Ezekiel had warned. The Babylonian army came and attacked the city. They broke down the walls, burned the temple, and took many people captive to Babylon. This was a very sad time for the people of Judah. They lost their homes, their city, and their freedom. They felt like God had abandoned them. But Ezekiel's messages did not end with the destruction. He also spoke of hope for the future. Even though things looked very bad, Ezekiel had a vision of hope for the future. He saw a valley full of dry bones. God asked him, "Son of man, can these bones live?" Ezekiel answered, "Lord, you know." God told Ezekiel to speak to the bones and tell them to come back to life. As Ezekiel spoke, the bones started to rattle and come together. Muscles and skin grew on them, and then breath entered them, and they stood up as a great army. This vision meant that even though the people of Israel were like dead bones scattered and hopeless, God could bring them back to life again. He would gather them from all the places where they had been scattered and bring them back to their own land. Ezekiel had another vision of a new temple and a new Jerusalem. This temple was much grander and more glorious than the old one. It was a symbol of God's presence returning to his people and their relationship with him being made new. The New Jerusalem was a city of peace and righteousness, where God would rule forever. This vision showed that even though the present was full of suffering, there was a future of hope and blessing waiting for God's people. Ezekiel's messages were not always easy to understand. They were full of strange visions and symbols, but they all pointed to the same important truths. God is holy. Just he punishes sin, but he also loves his people and wants to forgive them. He has a plan to restore them and bring them back to himself. Even when things seem hopeless, there is always hope in God's promises. Ezekiel's ministry was a difficult one, but it was also a very important one because he was able to stand firm in his faith and proclaim God's message, even when the people refused to listen and he faced opposition. And so this steadfastness and faithfulness of Ezekiel serves as an example to people everywhere. One of the main lessons that we can learn from Ezekiel is that we must always respect God's holiness, because Ezekiel always stressed the importance of revering and obeying God, which shows us that God is not to be taken lightly, and he must be approached with respect and reverence. Ezekiel reminds us that God is always watching, and we will always be held responsible for our actions. And so we must strive to live in a way that pleases him. Another lesson that we can learn from Ezekiel is that we must always be hopeful even in times of disaster, because Ezekiel, even while he was delivering the messages of judgment to the Israelites, still had the messages of hope for the future and for restoration and renewal. And that showed the unwavering faith and that God's compassion transcends even the most difficult of circumstances. Ezekiel is also a prophet who teaches us the importance of obedience, because Ezekiel listened to God's instructions, no matter how strange or difficult they might have been. And so this teaches us that we too must trust in God's wisdom and follow his lead even when we are unsure or afraid. And so by being obedient to God's commandments, we will be able to align ourselves with God's will and experience his blessings. Ezekiel in the Bible shows us that God can take someone who is ordinary and use them in an extraordinary way, because even though Ezekiel was just a priest, he was chosen by God to deliver messages to the Israelites during a time of great crisis. And this shows us that God can use anyone who is willing to be faithful and obedient. And so, like Ezekiel, we should all be willing to be used by God, no matter our limitations or weaknesses. The message of Ezekiel is timeless, and so it speaks to us today as it did to the people of ancient Israel, because it reminds us of God's sovereignty, his holiness, his justice, and his love. And so by studying Ezekiel, we can gain a better understanding of God and ourselves, and also the world around us. And so we should all strive to be like Ezekiel and be faithful, obedient, and hopeful in all that we do, and also to always trust in God's plan for our lives. Ezekiel's book ends with a vision of the new temple and the new Jerusalem. This is a picture of hope for the future when God will restore his people and live among them forever. It is a promise that even though there will be difficult times, God will never abandon his people, and he will always have a plan to bring them back to himself. Ezekiel's story is a reminder that we can always trust in God's promises, even when things seem impossible. In the land of Israel long, long ago, there lived a priest named Ezekiel. He lived during a very hard time when the kingdom of Judah was about to fall apart. Ezekiel's story is found in the Bible in the book of Ezekiel. It's a story full of amazing visions, difficult messages, and God's promise to bring his people back home. Ezekiel wasn't in Jerusalem, the big city, when everything started to change. Instead, he was in Babylon, a faraway land where many people from Judah had been taken as prisoners. Book of Ezekiel starts by telling us about this in Ezekiel 1. It says, "In my 30th year, in the 4th month, on the 5th day, while I was among the exiles by the Kebar River, the heavens were opened, and I saw visions of God." Imagine Ezekiel sitting by the river, probably feeling sad and lost. He was far from his home, his family, and the temple where he used to serve God. Then suddenly, the sky opened up, and he saw something incredible. A powerful storm came from the north with a huge cloud and flashing fire. Inside the fire, there was something shiny like glowing metal. Out of the fire, Ezekiel saw 4 living creatures. They looked like humans, but each one had 4 faces, one of a human, one of a lion, one of an ox, and one of an eagle. They also had 4 wings, and their legs were straight like those of a man, but their feet looked like the hooves of a calf. These creatures were moving very fast like flashes of lightning, and wherever they went, the Spirit went with them. Next to these creatures, Ezekiel saw 4 wheels. Each wheel looked like it was made of sparkling jewels, and they were so high that they were scary. These wheels could move in any direction without turning, and the rims of the wheels were full of eyes all around. These amazing creatures and wheels showed Ezekiel how powerful and amazing God is. Above the creatures' heads, there was something like a platform that looked like shining ice, and above the platform there was something like a throne, and on the throne there was someone who looked like a man, but he was glowing with fire from the waist up, and from the waist down everything around him was bright like a rainbow. Ezekiel knew that this was God's glory, and he fell on his face in great respect. Then he heard a voice speaking to him in Ezekiel 2:1. The voice said, "Son of man, stand up, I am going to speak to you." As he spoke, the Spirit entered me and set me on my feet, and I listened to him speaking to me. God told Ezekiel that he was sending him to the people of Israel. They were stubborn and rebellious, and they didn't want to listen to God's messages. Ezekiel had a very difficult job ahead of him. God warned him that the people wouldn't listen to him because they didn't want to obey God. But God told Ezekiel not to be afraid of them. He had to speak God's words, whether they liked it or not. God gave Ezekiel a scroll. It was like an ancient book written on both sides. God told him to eat the scroll. When Ezekiel ate it, it tasted as sweet as honey in his mouth. This showed that even though God's message might be hard to say, it was good and true. Ezekiel went to the exiles in Babylon and sat with them for 7 days. He was amazed and probably a little scared by everything he had seen and heard. But he knew he had to do what God had told him to do. He was God's watchman for the people of Israel. God told Ezekiel that he was like a watchman for the people. If Ezekiel saw danger coming, he had to warn them. If he didn't warn them and they got hurt, it would be Ezekiel's fault. But if he warned them and they still didn't listen, then Ezekiel would be safe. Ezekiel started to speak God's messages to the people. They were hard messages about how they had turned away from God and how their city Jerusalem would be destroyed because of their sins. He used stories and actions to help them understand. One day God told Ezekiel to draw a picture of Jerusalem on a brick. Then he had to act like he was attacking the city. He built walls around it and set up camps to show how the city would be surrounded. This was a way for Ezekiel to show the people what was going to happen. God also told Ezekiel to lie on his left side for 390 days to show how long the people of Israel would suffer for their sins. Then he had to lie on his right side for 40 days to show how long the people of Judah would suffer. Ezekiel had to cook his food using cow poop instead of wood. This was to show that the people in Jerusalem would have very little food during the attack, and they would have to eat unclean things. Ezekiel didn't want to do this, but God let him use animal dung instead. Ezekiel shaved off his hair and beard. He divided the hair into 3 piles. 1 pile he burned in the city, 1 pile he chopped up with a sword, and 1 pile he scattered in the wind. This showed how the people of Jerusalem would be killed. Some would die in the city. Some would be killed outside the city. And some would be scattered to other lands. Ezekiel was like a living picture, showing the people the bad things that would happen if they didn't turn back to God. But the people didn't listen, they kept doing bad things, and they didn't believe Ezekiel's messages. Ezekiel had a vision of what was happening in the temple in Jerusalem. He saw terrible things that the people were doing there in secret. He saw idols being worshipped and terrible sins being committed. This showed how far the people had turned away from God. God told Ezekiel that his wife would die suddenly. She was the joy of his life. But God told Ezekiel not to cry or show any sadness when she died. This was another way for Ezekiel to show the people how they would feel when Jerusalem was destroyed. They would be so shocked and sad that they wouldn't even be able to cry. Soon after this, Jerusalem was attacked and destroyed, just like Ezekiel had said. The temple was burned down, and many people were killed or taken away as prisoners. Ezekiel's messages had come true. Even though Ezekiel had given the people many warnings about the bad things that would happen, he also had a message of hope. He promised that God would bring his people back to their land one day, and he would make them a new nation. Ezekiel had a vision of a valley full of dry bones. God asked him, "Can these bones live?" Ezekiel answered, "Only you know, Lord." God told Ezekiel to speak to the bones and tell them to come back to life. As Ezekiel spoke, the bones started to move and come together. Then muscles and skin grew on them, and finally they stood up as a huge army. This vision showed that even though the people of Israel were like dead bones, God could bring them back to life again. He would give them a new heart and a new spirit, and he would bring them back to their land. Ezekiel also had a vision of a new temple, a beautiful and perfect temple that would be built in Jerusalem. This new temple would be a place where God's glory would dwell, and where people could worship him in truth. Ezekiel saw a river flowing out of the new temple. The river flowed to the Dead Sea, and it made the salty water fresh and full of life. This showed that God's blessing would bring healing and life to everything it touched. Ezekiel's visions of the new temple and the river of life gave the people hope for the future. They knew that even though they were suffering, now God had a plan to restore them and bless them. Ezekiel's book ends with a promise of a new Jerusalem, a city where God would live with his people forever. This city would be called "The Lord is there," showing that God would always be with them. Ezekiel's story is a reminder that even when things look really bad, God is still in control. He has a plan for his people, and he will never give up on them even when they make mistakes. Ezekiel's messages of warning and hope are still important for us today. They remind us to turn away from sin and trust in God's promises. Ezekiel's life was hard. He had to deliver difficult messages to people who didn't want to listen. But he was faithful to God, and he obeyed him even when it was hard. His story shows us that God can use ordinary people to do amazing things. Ezekiel's visions are strange and wonderful. They are full of symbols and meanings that can be hard to understand, but they show us the power and glory of God, and they give us a glimpse of what God has planned for the future. Ezekiel's prophecies came true. Many years later, the people of Israel did return to their land, and they rebuilt the temple and the city of Jerusalem. This showed that God's promises are true, and he always keeps his word. Ezekiel's story is a story of judgment and hope. It reminds us that God is just, and he will punish sin, but he is also merciful, and he will forgive those who turn to him. Ezekiel's book is a powerful reminder of God's love and his plan for his people. Ezekiel's life was like a river winding through tough times and hopeful dreams. He was a priest, someone who helped people connect with God, but his life changed forever when he was taken away from his home in Jerusalem. Along with many other people, they were forced to live in a faraway land called Babylon. This was a very sad time for the Israelites, as their beloved city and temple were destroyed, and they felt lost and alone in Babylon. Ezekiel didn't give up on God. Instead, he became a prophet, messenger who shared God's words and visions with the people. God showed Ezekiel amazing and sometimes scary visions. These visions were like movies in his mind, showing him what was happening and what was to come. One of the most famous visions was of a valley full of dry bones. God asked Ezekiel, "Can these bones live?" And Ezekiel answered, "Lord, you know." Then God told Ezekiel to speak to the bones, and as he did, they came back to life. This vision was a powerful message of hope For the Israelites, it meant that even though they felt like they were dead and gone, God could bring them back to life and restore them to their land. Ezekiel's visions weren't always easy to understand. They were full of symbols and strange images like wheels within wheels and creatures with four faces. But Ezekiel tried his best to explain what they meant. He wanted the people to understand that God was still with them, even in their darkest hour. He wanted them to turn away from their bad choices and return to God with all their hearts. Ezekiel also talked about a time when God would make a new covenant with his people. This meant that God would make a new agreement with them, promising to forgive their sins and write his laws on their hearts. This new covenant would be a time of great peace and happiness when God's people would live together in harmony. Ezekiel's book is not just a collection of visions and prophecies. It's also a story about God's faithfulness and his unwavering love for his people. Even when they made mistakes and turned away from him, God never gave up on them. He always offered them a chance to return and start anew. Ezekiel's words are still important today. They remind us that God is always with us, even when we face difficult times. They teach us that even when we feel lost and alone, God can bring us back to life and restore us to wholeness. Ezekiel's story is a testament to the power of hope and the enduring love of God, a love that extends to all people in all times. Now, let's journey back even further in time to meet another important figure. The Bible. Abraham's story is one of courage, faith, and a special promise from God. Abraham lived in a land called Ur, a place that was full of idols and false gods. But Abraham believed in only one true God. This belief set him apart from everyone else, and it led him on an incredible journey. God spoke to Abraham and told him to leave his home and his family and go to a new land that God would show him. This was a big ask for Abraham because he was already old and he had a comfortable life, but Abraham trusted God and he obeyed without hesitation. He packed up his belongings, gathered his family, and set out on a long and difficult journey. As Abraham traveled, God made a special promise to him. God said that he would make Abraham the father of a great nation, and that through him all the families of the earth would be blessed. This was an amazing promise, and it gave Abraham hope and courage as he faced the challenges of his journey. Abraham and his wife Sarah traveled for many years, facing many hardships along the way. They were often tired and hungry, and they had to deal with conflicts with other tribes. But Abraham never lost his faith in God. He knew that God was with him and that he would fulfill his promises. One of the biggest challenges that Abraham and Sarah faced was that they couldn't have children in those days. Having children was very important because it meant that your family would continue and that you would have someone to take care of you in your old age. Sarah was very sad that she couldn't have children, and she began to doubt whether God would really fulfill his promise to make Abraham the father of a great nation. But God reminded Abraham of his promise, and he told him that Sarah would have a son even though she was very old. Abraham and Sarah were overjoyed. When they finally had a son, they named him Isaac, which means laughter, because they laughed when God told them they would have a child. Abraham's faith was tested again when God asked him to sacrifice Isaac as an offering. This was a very difficult request because Isaac was Abraham's only son, and he loved him very much. But Abraham obeyed God, and he prepared to sacrifice Isaac. Just as Abraham was about to kill Isaac, an angel of the Lord stopped him and said, "Do not lay a hand on the boy, for now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." Abraham had shown that he was willing to give up everything for God, and God was pleased with his obedience. Abraham's story is a powerful example of faith and obedience. It teaches us that we should always trust God, even when we don't understand his plans. It also reminds us that God is always faithful to his promises, even when things seem impossible. Abraham's descendants became the nation of Israel, and through them, Jesus Christ, the Savior of the world, was born. Now, let's turn our attention to another fascinating book in the Bible, the book of Daniel. Daniel was a young man who was taken captive to Babylon, along with Ezekiel and many other Israelites. Daniel was known for his wisdom, his courage, and his unwavering faith in God. In Babylon, Daniel served in the court of King Nebuchadnezzar, who was a powerful and ruthless ruler. Daniel quickly gained the king's favor because of his ability to interpret dreams. One night King Nebuchadnezzar had a disturbing dream, and he demanded that his wise men tell him what it meant, but none of them could figure it out. Finally, Daniel was brought before the king, and he asked God to reveal the meaning of the dream to him. God showed Daniel that the dream was about the rise and fall of kingdoms. Daniel told the king that his kingdom would be followed by other kingdoms that would eventually be destroyed and replaced by God's eternal kingdom. King Nebuchadnezzar was impressed by Daniel's wisdom, and he promoted him to a high position in the kingdom. But Daniel's success made some of the other officials jealous. They plotted to get rid of him by tricking the king into issuing a decree that everyone should worship only him. Anyone who refused would be thrown into a den of lions. Daniel refused to worship the king because he only worshipped God. He was arrested and thrown into the lion's den. But God sent an angel to protect Daniel, and the lions did not harm him. The next morning, King Nebuchadnezzar was amazed to find Daniel alive. And well, he realized that Daniel's God was the true God, and he issued a decree that everyone in his kingdom should worship him. Daniel continued to serve in the Babylonian court under different kings. He had many more visions and prophecies about the future of Israel and the coming of the Messiah. Daniel's book is full of hope and encouragement. It reminds us that God is in control of everything and that he will ultimately triumph over evil. Daniel's story teaches us to be faithful to God no matter what challenges we face. Now, let's explore the story of Esther, a brave and beautiful woman who saved her people from destruction. Esther was a Jewish woman who lived in Persia during the reign King Ahasuerus. She was an orphan, and she was raised by her cousin Mordecai. King Ahasuerus was looking for a new queen, and Esther was chosen to be one of the candidates. The king was so impressed by Esther's beauty and grace that he made her his queen. But Esther kept her Jewish identity a secret because Mordecai had warned her not to reveal it. Haman, the king's highest official, was a wicked and arrogant man. He hated the Jews, and he plotted to destroy them all. He convinced the king to issue a decree that all the Jews in the kingdom should be killed. Mordecai learned about Haman's plot, and he told Esther about it. He urged her to go to the king and plead for her people's lives, but Esther was afraid because it was against the law to approach the king without being summoned. She could be put to death. Mordecai reminded Esther that she might have been chosen as queen for this very purpose. He told her that if she didn't speak up, God would find another way to save the Jews. Esther decided to take the risk. She fasted and prayed for 3 days, and then she went to the king. When the king saw Esther, he was pleased with her, and he extended his scepter to her. This meant that she was allowed to speak to him. Esther invited the king and Haman to a banquet. At the banquet, she revealed that she was Jewish and that Haman was planning to destroy her people. The king was furious when he learned about Haman's plot. He ordered that Haman should be hanged on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. The king also issued a new decree allowing the Jews to defend themselves against their enemies. The Jews fought bravely, and they defeated their enemies. Mordecai was promoted to Haman's position, and Esther became a national heroine. The story of Esther is celebrated every year during the Jewish festival of Purim. It's a story of courage, faith, and God's protection. Finally, let's consider the story of Jonah, a prophet who tried to run away from God. God told Jonah to go to the city of Nineveh and preach against its wickedness. But Jonah didn't want to go. He thought that the people of Nineveh were too evil to be saved. So he boarded a ship heading in the opposite direction. God sent a great storm to punish Jonah. The sailors were afraid, and they threw Jonah overboard. The storm stopped, and Jonah was swallowed by a giant fish. Jonah stayed in the belly of the fish for 3 days and 3 nights. He prayed to God and asked for forgiveness. God heard Jonah's prayer, and he commanded the fish to vomit Jonah onto dry land. Jonah then went to Nineveh and preached to the people. They listened to his message and they repented of their sins. God had compassion on them, and he didn't destroy the city. Jonah was angry because God had forgiven the people of Nineveh. He thought that they deserved to be punished. God taught Jonah a lesson about compassion. He showed him that he loved all people, even those who were wicked. Jonah's story teaches us that we should always obey God and that we should have compassion for others, even our enemies. These are just a few of the many fascinating stories and prophecies found in the Bible. These stories teach us about God's love, his justice, his mercy, and his plan for humanity. They offer hope, encouragement, and guidance for our lives. They challenge us to live according to God's will. And to make a positive difference in the world, the Bible is a treasure trove of wisdom and inspiration. It's a book that can change our lives forever if we are willing to open our hearts and minds to its message.